Hello and welcome to this session. We're in week 5 for the course Ancient History of the Ancient Near East and Ancient Greece. And within this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And we picked this up when talking a little bit about the reputation of cruelty that the Neo-Assyrian Empire has. Probably one of the most familiar to students of ancient history, as it is the period of the largest expansion of the empire. The kings of this period are ones most often associated and mentioned within the Bible. It's also an area which most decisively gives the Assyrian Empire the reputation it has for ruthlessness and cruelty. The Assyrians surely have amongst the worst press notices of any state in history. Babylon may be a by-name for corruption, decadence, and sin, but the Assyrians and their famous rulers, with terrifying names like Shalmaneser, Tiglath-Pileser, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal, rate in the popular imagination just below Adolf Hitler and Genghis Khan as far as cruelty and violence and sheer murderous savagery. This reputation is further noted by other historians that argue that while historians tend to shy away from analogies, it is tempting to see the Assyrian Empire, which dominated the Middle East from 900 to 612 BCE, as a historical forebearer of Nazi Germany, an aggressive, murderously vindictive regime supported by a magnificent and successful war machine. As with the German army of World War II, the Assyrian army was the most technologically and doctrinally advanced of its day and was a model for others for generations afterwards. The Assyrians were the first to make extensive use of iron weaponry, and not only were iron weapons superior to bronze, but could be mass-produced, allowing the equipping of very large armies indeed. While the reputation for decisive, ruthless military tactics is understandable, the comparison to the Nazi regime is less so. Unlike the Nazis, the Assyrians treated the conquered people they relocated well and considered them Assyrians once they had submitted to central authority. There was no concept of a master race in Assyrian policies. Everyone was considered an asset to the empire, whether they were born Assyrian or were assimilated into the culture. In truth, Assyrian warfare was no more savage than that of other contemporary states, nor indeed were the Assyrians notably crueler than, say, the Romans, who made a point of lining their roads with thousands of victims of crucifixion dying in agony. The only fair comparison between Nazi Germany of the Second World War and the Assyrians is the efficiency of the military and the size of the army. And this same comparison could be made with ancient Rome. These massive armies still lay in the future, though. So the Neo-Assyrians were the ones that established the prototype for this kind of large-scale, efficient armies. Now, the rise of King Adad Nirari II, who lived from and ruled from 912 to 891 BCE, brought the kind of revival Assyria needed at that time. The Assyrians had lost territory, prestige, and power following both the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, and invasions by the Arameans, the Amorites, and the Sea Peoples, the Phoenicians. Adad-nirari II reconquered the lands that had been lost and secured the borders. The defeated Arameans were executed or deported to regions within the heartland of Assyria and assimilated into the culture. He also conquered Babylon, but learning from the mistakes of the past, because back in 1225 BCE, when the Assyrians conquered Babylon, the king was later assassinated, and it was believed that it was because he angered the gods. So this king refused to plunder the city and instead entered into a peace treaty with the king in which they married each other's daughters and pledged mutual loyalty. The treaty would secure Babylon as a powerful ally instead of a perennial problem, at least for the next century. The kings who followed Adad-nirari II continued the same policies and military expansion. Nikulti Ninurta, who ruled from 891 to 884 BCE, expanded the empire to the north and gained further territory toward the south in Anatolia. While Ashurbanipal II, who ruled from 884 to 859 BCE, consolidated rule in the Levant and extended Assyrian rule through Canaan. Ashurbanipal II moved the capital from Ashur to his newly built city of Kalhu, which he adorned with over 40 types of trees, which he carried back from his various campaigns. Kalhu was built through slave labor, also brought back from these campaigns, which had been successful in subjugating a significant amount of territory. In battle, he had employed the Assyrians' most common method of conquest, siege warfare, which would begin with a brutal assault on the city. As one historian writes, more than anything else, the Assyrian army excelled in siege warfare and was probably the first force to carry a separate corps of engineers. Assault was their principal tactic against the heavily fortified cities of the Near East. They developed a variety of methods for breaching enemy walls. Sappers were employed to undermine walls or to light fires underneath wooden gates, and ramps were thrown up to allow men to go over the ramparts or to attempt a breach on the upper section of the wall where it was least thick. Mobile ladders allowed attackers to cross moats and quickly assault any point in defenses. These operations were covered by masses of archers, who were the core of the infantry. But the pride of the Assyrian siege train were their engines. These were multi-storied wooden towers with 4 wheels and a turret on the top, and 1 or 2 battering rams at the base. Advancements in military technology were not the only or even the primary contribution of the Assyrians, as during this same time they made significant progress in medicine, building on the foundation of the Sumerians and drawing on the knowledge and talents of those that they had conquered and assimilated. Ashurbanipal II was the first made the first systemic lists of plants and animals in the empire and brought scribes with him on campaigns to record new finds. Schools were established throughout the empire, but were only for the sons of the wealthy and nobility. Women were not allowed to attend school or hold positions of authority, even though earlier in Mesopotamia, women had enjoyed almost equal rights. The decline in women's rights correlates to the rise of Assyrian monotheism. As the Assyrian armies campaigned throughout their land, their god Ashur went with them. But as Ashur was previously linked with the temple of that city and had only been worshipped there, a new way of imagining the god became necessary in order to continue his worship and enlist his aid in other locales. As one historian writes, one might pray to Ashur not only in his temple in his own city, but anywhere. As the Assyrian Empire expanded its borders, Ashur was encountered in even the most distant places. From faith in an omnipresent God to belief in a single God is not a long step. Since he was everywhere, people came to understand that, in some sense, local divinities were just different manifestations of the same Ashur. This unity of vision of a supreme deity helped to further unify the regions of the empire. The different gods of the conquered peoples and their various religious practices became absorbed into the worship of Ashur. He was recognized as the one true God who had been called different names by different people in the past, but who now was clearly known and could be properly worshipped as the universal deity. The Assyrian culture became increasingly cohesive with the expansion of the empire, the new understanding of the deity, and the assimilation of the people from the conquered regions. Shalmaneser III, who ruled from around 859 to 824 BCE, expanded the empire up through the coast of the Mediterranean and received tribute from the wealthy Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon. He also defeated the Armenian kingdom of Urartu, at least temporarily, which had long proved a very significant nuisance to the Assyrians. Following his reign, however, the empire erupted into a civil war as the king Shamshi-Adad V, from 824 to 811, fought with his brother for control, and there does seem to be a cycle of family infighting that continues within Assyria from this point onward. Although the rebellion was put down, expansion of the empire halted after Shalmaneser III. The regent Shemuramat, also famously known as Semiramis, who became the mythical goddess queen of the Assyrians in later tradition, held the throne for her young son Adad-nirari III from 811 to 806 BCE, and in that time secured the borders of the empire and organized successful campaigns to put down the Medes and other troublesome populaces in the north. When her son came of age, she was able to hand him a stable and sizable empire, which Adad-nirari III then expanded further. Following his reign, however, his successors preferred to rest on the accomplishments of others, and the empire entered another period of stagnation. And this was especially detrimental to the military, which languished under kings like Ashur-dan III and Ashur-nirari V. Now, the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, he conquered Tel Ammar in 856 BC and transformed it into an Assyrian royal city, renaming it Kar Shalmaneser, the harbor or gate of Shalmaneser. Many of the features of this important outpost are dominated by Assyrian cultural traditions, town planning, fortifications, defenses, palace architecture, sculpture, and other luxury products reflect strong cultural influences from the Assyrian homeland. Now, this strategy of conquest was intended to legitimize Assyrian control of the conquered lands. However, the pattern of cultural domination and assimilation, I suggest, should not be viewed as a one-way process. So we'll examine Tel Ammar, a Neo-Assyrian colony. It's on the edge of the empire by looking at the archaeology of the Assyrian frontier. And this will show that a more nuanced approach is required in understanding a serious relationship with its western periphery and the related processes of colonization, legitimization, and acculturation. So during the Mesopotamian Iron Age, so from around 1000 to 600 BCE, the Assyrian Empire was the greatest power the world had yet known. For much of this period, Assyrian dominated the entire Near East, from the Zagros Mountains in modern Iran to the eastern Mediterranean, and from the Taurus ranges in southern Turkey to the Persian Gulf. Assyria's historical importance lies in the fact that the Assyrian state represented an entirely new level of political development. The Assyrians were the first true empire builders. It was upon their legacy that later empires such as the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans were modeled. The conditions that brought about the rise of Assyria and Assyrian imperialism are far from clear. The political crisis that marked the end of the second millennium in the late Bronze Age paved the way for an Assyrian rise to power. But the impetus behind Assyria's ascent must be seen as a very complex web of interrelated political, economic, and social factors. So between about 1200 to 900 BCE, a dark age descends over the Near East, and we see this very strongly in the Greeks. But it also includes the Egyptians in the Nile Valley and other parts of the Mediterranean world. The region did not become deserted, but there was clearly a mass movement of people from a settled urban way of life to a more nomadic existence. There could be little doubt that the Near East was in a recession. And it's been suggested that this decline was triggered by environmental factors, climate change. It's thought that drought, famine brought on these changes in weather, and natural calamities reduced the agricultural yields and produced the political instability, encouraging the mass movement of these people. It's also widely conceded that this movement of people, the Sea Peoples, as they are often referred to, contributed to the upheaval and caused severe disruption in trade, especially the trade in metals. Shortages in things like copper and particularly tin made it impossible to produce bronze. Confronted with these shortages, the metalsmiths of the late second millennium needed to find an alternative source of metal, and they started using iron. The events which coincide with the end of the Bronze Age stimulated a very, very significant technological development known to us from archaeological times as what we now call the Iron Age. The demise of the Hittite kingdom in central Anatolia, the collapse of the 20th dynasty in Egypt, left no strong power to dominate. And Assyria, although weakened, it survived these turbulent events through the end of the second millennium, more or less intact. and so comparatively speaking, it was stronger than all its neighbors. Part of that has to do with the strategic location of Assyria. The Assyrian homeland in northern Mesopotamia, the conditions here were suitable for dry farming, unlike the irrigation practices needed in the south. The Zagros and Taros mountain ranges formed a natural buffer protecting Assyria's eastern and northern frontiers. With Babylonia located in the south, it was only natural that the Assyrians would look to the west in the expansion towards the Mediterranean of their empire. The history of Assyria may be conveniently divided into three broad periods: the Old, the Middle, and the New. So we're focusing here on the historical developments of the Neo-Assyrian period in the first millennium. It was during the Neo-Assyrian period that the Assyrian Empire expanded westward and reached its maximum extent. The texts from the Neo-Assyrian period are extremely detailed, and from about 900 BCE onwards, we have a series of records known as the Assyrian Royal Annals, describing the relentless annual campaigns of the successive Neo-Assyrian kings. Each new reign extended Assyrian influence far beyond the traditional homeland of Assyria. The seven most famous Neo-Assyrian kings, of course: Ashurbanipal, who figures prominently next. Shalmaneser III, a very important figure because of his relation to Tel Ammar, Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and of course Ashurbanipal. The copious inscriptions left by this dynasty of rulers record particularly their military successes over their neighbors. Not surprisingly, these accounts are one-sided and often historically unreliable. Only Assyrian victories are recorded, while Assyrian defeats are never mentioned or claimed as victories. For example, peoples of the four regions of divergent speech, living in mountains and in flat lands, through the might of my scepter I unified their languages. I dispatched Assyrians to them as overseers and commanders, competent to teach them good behavior. I built the city with the labor of the peoples of the lands, which my hands had captured, and I called it Dur-Shurakin, Kor-Abad, the fortress of Sargon. Now, this text it gives us an idea about the Assyrian mentality. The Assyrian, Neo-Assyrian imperial attitude of conquest as an act of introducing civilized behavior. The use of deported labor in the construction of the empire's capital cities. Of course, the key Assyrian sites are all located in a triangle close to the Tigris in northern Mesopotamia: Ashur, Nimrud, Khorsabad, and Nineveh. These different consecutive capitals of the Neo-Assyrian Empire are large urban centers supporting teeming populations. They're all characterized by very, very distinctive attributes in Assyrian town planning: the use of inner and outer cities, the fortification, and of course the impressive gateways that mark the entrance into the royal court. Ashur can be seen. Ashur, we can see a large complex surrounded by a city wall, enclosing the royal complex made up of palaces and temples, strategically located on the Tigris River. Nimrud, another capital, again, We see inner and outer cities, palaces and complexes, large urban centers. And Nineveh, the palace without rival. You can see heavily fortified and again strategically located with these defensive walls all around it. And Khorsabad, the capital of Sargon, marked by many gates, flanked by the winged bulls of Lamassu, protecting the entrance into the royal court. At the center of the Assyrian city was the vast royal palace. The Neo-Assyrian kings constructed a series of magnificent palaces. Each new king built his own palace, first Ashur, then later examples at Nimrud, Khorsabad, and Nineveh. An innovation of the Assyrian palaces was that the walls of the palace courtyards and the throne rooms were decorated with massive, elaborately carved stone reliefs. The themes of the reliefs showed the king in the traditional Assyrian roles of monarch, high priest, warrior, and hunter. These carved panels, and we see examples in many museums around the world, introduced the full use of historical narrative in the history of Mesopotamian art. These are masterpieces of Near Eastern artistic production. The majority of depictions feature, of course, the Assyrian king, the Assyrian army on campaign in foreign lands, laying siege to enemies, accumulating and deporting foreign prisoners and booty, receiving tributaries, and engaging in royal hunting expeditions. The scenes and the reliefs actively promote the power, the invincibility of the king and of the Assyrian army. More broadly, it can be asserted that the Assyrian annals and the palace reliefs served as integrated representations of Assyrian state ideology and of the ideals of the Assyrian Empire. Without doubt, some of the finest examples of Assyrian sculpture are Ashurbanipal's palace reliefs, which include the much celebrated lion hunts. These reliefs, perhaps more than any others, represent the artistic accomplishments of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Within the complex of Neo-Assyrian political and imperialistic ideology, one of the themes that has the greatest importance is the representation of the non-Assyrian, who is viewed as an alien, as an enemy of a other reality. The Assyrians deliberately employed techniques to distinguish ethnic identity. Scale, always smaller. Physical characteristics, always exaggerated or deformed. Dress, or more importantly, undressed, always semi, or if not completely naked. And context, always seen in foreign, inhospitable lands. It's not difficult to detect the non-Assyrian in the Assyrian reliefs. Many are shown meeting dreadful fates, ranging from capture to horrific mutilation, beheading, and flailings. The iconography, gesture, and composition of these images communicate one of Assyrian supremacy. The numerous wars of conquest beyond the immediate frontiers of the empire enriched the Assyrian state enormously. The confiscated items were amassed in great quantity and kept in specially designed storehouses back in the Assyrian capitals. The annals record that furniture was particularly prized by the Assyrian court. The wooden chairs, the tables, the footrests of the Assyrian palace have all perished, and it is mostly from the sculpted reliefs that give us any idea of what these items were. Often, all that remain of the furniture are the ivory inlays, which originally decorated the wooden furnishings. The Assyrian annals describe in great detail how ivory was acquired by the Assyrian kings. Many of the cities along the eastern Mediterranean had their own schools of ivory carving. Examples of the different styles can be easily detected. They range from those closely related to the art of Egypt, known as Phoenician ivories, to powerful images like those on the stone monuments of the Aramean and Neo-Hittite kingdoms, called Syrian ivories, as well as distinctive Assyrian style. One of the most abundant commodities from Assyria is pottery. By far, the finest pottery is the so-called palace wares, consisting of egg-shell, thin-walled bowls and beakers. Below the Assyrian palaces were vaulted tombs, family crypts, like those examples discovered beneath the Northwest Palace at Nimrud. Whilst all the kings of Assyria were buried at Ashur, the traditional city, it seems as if the royal women, the wives, were buried here at Nimrud, Nineveh, or of course, Abad. These tombs contained grave goods, including gold jewelry and vessels of outstanding quality and workmanship. Now, from this brief survey of the Neo-Assyrian period, it's possible to form a picture of the distinctive hallmarks of Assyrian culture. The annals and texts, palaces and palace reliefs, furniture, carved ivories, luxury goods, pottery, all reflect the distinctive material culture associated with the Neo-Assyrian capitals. For the most part, research on the Assyrian Empire is concentrated on the Assyrian homeland, that is, the Assyrian capital cities. Until recently, few archaeological excavations have focused on the peripheral regions, the areas that were colonized by the Neo-Assyrian kings. Tel Amar indicated is one of those that have been excavated by the University of Melbourne and is an important Assyrian colony located on the east bank of the Euphrates River in northern Syria, strategically situated on the western frontier of the Assyrian Empire. In 856 BCE, Shalmaneser III set off from Assyria and captured Tel Amar. He turned it into an Assyrian province, renaming it the town Kar Shalmaneser, the harbor or gate of Shalmaneser. And from this time on, Tel Amar became a very important outpost of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. For 10 years, archaeologists from the University of Melbourne undertook salvage excavations at Tel Amar. The excavations were necessitated by the construction of one of the several hydroelectric dams that in Syrian Turkey have flooded vast plains on either side of the Euphrates River. Tel Amar is a large semicircular site and consists of three main parts. At the center, the Tel, or the Acropolis, the middle city terrace, and the large semicircular lower city. Now, going on and talk a little bit about Tiglath-Pileser III, who lived from 744 to 727. Tiglath-Pileser has attracted scholarly interest since the very dawn of Assyriology, with the first discovery at Nimrud by Layard in the mid-19th century. The search for new evidence for this Assyrian monarch, who played a crucial role in stories told in the Bible, was of prime importance in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Since then, it's become fully apparent that his reign marked the beginning of the imperial phase of Assyria, and that this period of time should be regarded as a watershed of history in the ancient Near East. The kingdom of Assyria first formed as a territorial state, along with a provincial system in the 14th and 13th centuries. In the Middle Assyrian period, from the 12th to the mid-8th century, Assyrian territorial holdings were repeatedly reduced and expanded by the extension of the land of the god of Ashur. Assyria proper was confined to the borders established at the height of the Assyrian power of the Middle Assyrian period. Assyria's fortunes changed dramatically when Tiglath-Pileser III ascended to the throne. In the course of his 18th-year reign, this king reshaped the political map of the ancient Near East. With his vigorous annual campaigns, he annexed large territories in Syria and Palestine in the west, as well as other lands in the north, east, and south. He created many new provinces beyond the traditional borders of Assyria and utterly transformed the demographic nature of the entire Near East through the unprecedented large-scale two-way deportation of conquered peoples. Toward the end of his reign, he conquered Babylonia, and not only took the traditional title, the King of the lands of Sumer and Akkad, but also declared himself King of Babylon and participated in the Akitu festival at Babylon by taking the hand of the god Marduk, something none of his predecessors had done. The preparation of a new edition of the inscriptions of Tiglath-Pileser III and his son and successor Shalmaneser V. So, the empire was revitalized by Tiglath-Pileser III, who reorganized the military and restructured the bureaucracy of the government. According to some scholars, Tiglath-Pileser III carried out extensive reforms of the army, reasserted central control over the empire, reconquered the Mediterranean seaboard, and even subjugated Babylon. He replaced conscription in the military with a manpower levy imposed on each province, and also demanded contingents from vassal states. He also defeated the kingdom of Urartu, which had been, again, a trouble spot for Assyrian rulers, and subjugated the region of Syria. And according to some scholars, the Neo-Assyrian Empire actually begins really formally with Tiglath-Pileser III. As some scholars will argue, in the time between 745 and 705 BCE, the Assyrian Empire really took shape. This was the result not only of renewed military expansion, but also of new administrative structures that ensured much tighter political and fiscal control. Under Tiglath-Pileser III's reign, the Assyrian army became the most effective fighting force in history up to that time, and would provide a model for future armies in its organization, its tactics, its training, and its efficiency. Tiglath-Pileser III was followed by Shalmaneser V, who continued the king's policies but was not as effective in military campaigns. His successor, Sargon II, was a brilliant military leader and administrator who expanded the empire further than any king before him. Even though Sargon II's rule was contested by nobles who claimed that he had seized the throne illegally, he maintained the cohesion of the empire, expanded the borders, improved legislation and administration, and kept the royal treasure filled through his conquests. Following Tiglath-Pileser III's lead, Sargon was also able to bring the empire to its greatest height politically and militarily. So with Sargon II, he was followed by his son, Sennacherib, who campaigned widely and ruthlessly conquered Israel, Judah, and the Greek provinces in Anatolia. He put siege to Jerusalem, and that's detailed in what's known as the Taylor Prism, a cuneiform block describing Sennacherib's military exploits. His account is contested, however, by the version of events that we see in the biblical book of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles and the book of Isaiah. Now, according to the later Jewish historian Josephus, it went as follows. It was now the 14th year of the government of Hezekiah, king of the two tribes, when the king of Assyria, whose name was Sennacherib, made an expedition against him with a great army, and took all of the cities of the tribe of Judah and Benjamin by force. And when he was ready to bring his army against Jerusalem, Hezekiah sent ambassadors to him beforehand and promised to submit and pay what tribute he should appoint. Hereupon Sennacherib, when he heard of what offers the ambassadors made, resolved not to proceed in the war, but to accept the proposals that were made to him. And if he might receive 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold, he promised that he would depart in a friendly manner, and he would give security upon the oath to the ambassadors that they would not do him no harm, but go away from where he came. So Hezekiah submitted and emptied his treasuries and sent the money, as supposed he should be freed from his enemy and from any further distress about his kingdom. Accordingly, the Assyrian king took it, and yet had no regard for what he had promised. Now, when Sennacherib was returning from his Egyptian war to Jerusalem, he found his army under Rabshakeh, his general, in danger by a plague that God had sent, and a pestilence distemper against his army. And on the very night of the siege, 185,000 with their captains and generals were destroyed. So the king was in great dread and in a terrible agony at this calamity. And being in great fear for his whole army, he fled with the rest of his forces to his own kingdom. So that's part of the story of what went on here. Part of this is also the destruction of Jerusalem. There's a deportation of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrian Empire, the Assyrian captivity or the Assyrian exile of the Israelites. So the captivities began in 740 BCE and continued through to this time. So that's with Sennacherib. Then finally we have Ashurbanipal, and Ashurbanipal really kind of sees the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. He ruled over the empire for 42 years, and in that time campaigned successfully, and he ruled fairly efficiently. He had a son by the name of Esarhaddon, who was really the last stable leader of the empire. He extended the regions, but it's argued that he overtaxed, and that started to decline the popularity of the Assyrian Empire. When Ashurbanipal died in 627 BCE, the empire really began to fall apart. His successors, Ashur Etli Ilani and Sin-Shar Ishkun, were unable to hold the territories together as they began to break away. The rule of the Assyrian Empire was seen as being overly harsh by many of its subjects, and in spite of whatever advancements and luxuries that they had received from the Assyrians, they began to revolt. And in 612 BCE, Nineveh was sacked and burned by a coalition of the Babylonians, the Persians, the Medes, and the Scythians. And that really kind of marks the end of the Assyrian Empire. We'll look at that a little bit more in detail in the weeks to come, but that really kind of marks the end there in 612 BCE. And I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.